Welcome to Black History, Black Futures podcast 2024 season. This is episode 3, The Art of Afrofuturism. I'm Hillary McAndrew Plate, Public Programming and Partnerships Manager for the City of Virginia Beach Cultural Affairs Department. And on behalf of the city, we are proud to partner with our friends at Norfolk State University and Princess Anne County Training School Union Kempsville High School Alumni and Friends Association to present this series. This series began in 2021 to celebrate and extend Black History Month programming in Virginia Beach, launching Zoom panel presentations and oral history gatherings year-round, because Black history is U.S. history and it happens every day, all year long. As the series has grown, we're now excited to partner with Norfolk State University Radio WNSB Hot 91 and its illustrious director, Mr. Maynard Scales, to shift to the podcast platform, ensuring that even more students and audiences of all ages can access these valuable and dynamic discussions. Each year we focus on the annual National Black History Month theme, so this year we're diving into African Americans in the arts through 3 new podcast episodes, engaging Virginia artists and national and international artists based in other major cities. Episodes will be released in June, September, and December, and will be available anytime for download and streaming through Hot 91, NSU, and the City of Virginia Beach Cultural Affairs websites. Without further ado, I am grateful to work with 2 astoundingly intelligent, remarkably kind women who host this program and allow me the great privilege of sitting in with our remarkable guests for these discussions. Dr. Stephanie Richmond is the Associate Professor of History and the Director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for African Diaspora Studies, as well as the Director for the Soul Down River Program. And she is our digital and internet co-host and our panelist for this program. Thank you, Dr. Richmond.
Thank you.
Our moderator and host is the renowned author and educator, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. Dr. Newby-Alexander is the endowed professor of Virginia Black History and Culture, the Director Emeritus of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for African Diaspora Studies, and the Senior Scholar and Co-Founder for the Center for African American Public Policy at Norfolk State University. Her work has resulted in numerous acclaimed publications, such as Virginia Waterways and the Underground Railroad, and African American History of the Civil War in Hampton Roads, among others. She has published numerous articles and appeared on national programs for the BBC, C-SPAN, and the History Channel. Her work has garnered awards and significant grants to continue bringing attention to uncovering and preserving Black history in America. Take it away, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander.
Well, you're so very kind as usual, Hillary, and I just want to thank everyone for joining us in a discussion today about Afrofuturism. I am really excited about this particular topic, especially being a big fan for years of science fiction. And so I have always envisioned people of color as being a part of our future, which is not something that has been common. And so this theme that we're talking about, that the Association for the Study of African American Life and History created, they are the founders not only of that association, but of Black History Month. And of course, we celebrate, commemorate, talk about these themes of Black History Month throughout the year. And so this year, in 2024, the theme is African Americans and the Arts. And it's about exploring the concepts of resilience, creativity, innovation from a culture that often has been marginalized, but has actually been responsible for uplifting spirits and soothing souls in America for over 400 years. And of course, the arts, by the arts, we mean music, song, dance, literature, folk tales, art, and a whole host of other things, including spoken word, including fashion design. So the art of Afrofuturism is a cultural aesthetic that combines science fiction, fantasy, and history to explore the Black experience and its connections to Africa and the diaspora. But it is also a way to take the discussion of the future through the lens of blacks so that they're both present and inclusive. So African Americans, of course, have often been excluded from the future. They've either been erased, marginalized, or been the sacrificial lamb, so that at the end of the story, black people don't exist, and therefore their continuation doesn't exist. And so Afrofuturism throws that playbook out, and it goes back to, let's think about the future through a different lens, and let's incorporate and celebrate this history, this background, this culture that we come from, and lift that up and make that an immediate and present part of how we talk about our present and our future. So it is a way also that African American artists in particular have used art to preserve this history, this cultural memory, and of course empowerment. And there are these different culture movements on which Afrofuturism is a part of, and it's this continuum that we've seen, starting from the New Negro, Black Arts, Black Renaissance, which is also formally called the Harlem Renaissance, hip-hop, and Afrofuturism. And I just want to take a moment. I have representations of art pieces from three of those categories. But I wanted to take a minute just to explain for our audience this concept of the New Negro. This was something that was created by black artists at the turn of the 20th century, in part in reaction to all the stereotypes, all the negative perceptions of blacks as white society was trying to create a rationale for why black people were second-class citizens and marginalized. The creation of all these stereotypes to the point that they were globally disseminated through our commercial and our marketing systems. And instead of allowing that to happen in silence, African Americans began to write, began to speak, began to display their art to show a different side of African American history and of African Americans, a different representation that was not belittling, stereotyped, or whatever. In other words, they were pushing for empowerment. And we would see that continue with the Black Arts, Black Renaissance movement that actually went beyond the 1920s into the 1930s and 40s. We would see this birth, this explosion of artistic, musical, theatrical demonstrations, literary. And of course, we would see scholars as well as practitioners beginning to highlight their perspective and began to show their voices so that black identity and life were more accurately depicted as opposed to put in this stereotypic box. And then we would see hip-hop, this particular movement, which often is just defined as a music genre, but rather it is much more than that. When you think of hip-hop, you think about commercialism, you think about fashion design, you think about language, the spoken word, you think about a way of life or a way of movement. So hip-hop has become much bigger, and it is one of the, I would say, the most impactful of all of these forms of artistic expression that has had a global impact, a very real and present global impact with, well, they're not young anymore when it got started, but initially with younger people and then has continued. And then, of course, Afrofuturism, which is the subject of our conversation today, that looks at science fiction, that looks at history, that looks at fantasy, and it talks about and explores the Black experience. And so with that, I am excited to introduce our amazing two panelists. And the first one is Kyra Sims. She is a collaborative French hornist, vocalist, writer, and, of course, actress who resides in New York City. She's worked with artists and ensembles such as Lizzo, Jean-Baptiste, Earth, Wind and Fire, The Roots, Carole King, and a whole host of other individuals, many of whom that most people know about. In 2022, she was named the co-artistic director of the New York Neo-Futurists, a wildly prolific experimental theater ensemble that creates and performs its own work in the East Village every Friday and Saturday night for their landmark award-winning show, The Infinite Wrench. Kyra is a collaborative musician, writer, and actress, and of course, I'm hoping that she talks a little bit more about what she means by a collaborative musician and actress. I know what she means, but I hope she will talk about that, because that's part of what we're trying to do, is to make sure that people stop seeing Black history and culture through the lens of a box. She has worked both on Broadway as well as off-Broadway, originating chairs at Tony-nominated Broadway shows such as Illinois', Carmen Jones' Superhero, and Soft Power. She has appeared as a musician in the Taylor Max Pulitzer finalist work, A 24-Decade History of Popular Music. She has a long list of recording credits, and we are very honored to have Kyra Sims join us today. Our other panelist is Nastassja Swift. And Nastassja is a multidisciplinary artist holding a BFA from Virginia Commonwealth University. And of course, she does sculpture, performance, installation, film, and collaboration. And I want to pause by saying, if you look at the background of both Nastassja as well as Kyra, they are in their element. Behind Kyra is the backstage area, and behind Nastassja are creations that she will talk about in just a minute. But Nastassja in 2022 was selected as the Distinguished Fellow at the Penland School of Craft, which was recently commissioned by the SCAD Museum of Arts to perform Turning Seeds, a collaborative and site-specific mass performance. In 2019, her short film and collaborative performance entitled Remembering Her Homecoming premiered at the Africana Independent Film Festival and was screened at the Virginia Film Festival in Charlottesville. She was selected by the Public Arts Commission in Richmond, Virginia, her first large-scale public art project. She's the recipient of the Center for Craft Research Fund Artist Fellowship. She's a VMFA Fellowship awardee, and a whole list of other fellowships. She's participated in national and international residencies and exhibitions, including her solo exhibit in Doha, Qatar, in 2016, as well as being at Mass MoCA in Massachusetts, Vermont Studio Center, Spaces in Ohio, and the Carl Friedman Gallery in the UK. She's currently living and working in Petersburg. Welcome, both Nastassja and Kyra. And I am interested in going into the first question, and I hope that my first question will inspire you to talk a little bit about also what is your current environment, and tell us a little bit about that. But let me start with the first question. So how does Afrofuturism express notions of Black identity, agency, and freedom through art, creative works, and activism that envision liberated futures for Black life?
Yeah, thanks so much, Cassandra. So happy to be here. Afrofuturism is such a beautiful topic to me, especially as someone who grew up reading a lot of like fantasy and science fiction that often centers white stories. It's often like very colonialist to like have a whole genre that really like centers the Black experience and imagines us in the future is indeed very liberating. I really love like N.K. Jemisin, the way that she navigates Afrofuturism, and it's just very a lot of I feel like she like really runs the gamut where there's like stories where there's a lot of sort of like carefree stories, which isn't afforded us a lot in mainstream media, and then but then also addresses and has characters that are experiencing being marginalized very much like African Americans are today. So there's so many ways to tell the stories. I love envisioning a future where there is lots of carefree existing as Black people.
Thank you, Natasja.
Hello. When I thought about Afrofuturism through in context to this conversation, this panel, and its relation to my work, also I'm in my studio, and quite a bit of my needle felted work is around me. A few words came to mind, and I think reimagination was a big one, and how reimagination, reimagining a landscape or a situation or the identity or use of an object, the functionality of an object, I think is something that is so inherently Black, and like the way we reframe what's happening around us, sometimes for safety, or for pleasure or joy, the way we can take something and shift it out of its original use to become multi-purposeful and multifunctional. I think all of these like base level things that don't those words might not appear to be talking about Afrofuturism, but I think within my work and the stories that I'm interested in telling, so much of that is a part of it, and breaking outside of the box or doing what's not conventional. I think that is what kind of reels me in. And I think it plays a big role in how Afrofuturism and this futuristic these like stories rooted in futurism, how they show up in all those different forms of art.
I'm going to get you to keep talking, Natasja. How has Afrofuturism informed your work in particular?
Just a few months ago, I rewatched Space is the Place by Sun Ra, and it's because I'm working on a new body of work, but I was really interested. I think what made me return to that film was his garment and the way he dresses, and thinking about fashion and garment, and also like identity as a way as tools or as a vehicle to or for the future. I thought a lot about what one wears on their head and how that might aid in this journey to a reimagined place or a future place. I think the way I'm thinking about my mask and these portals that become a part of the work, this channeling of spiritual energy, all of that feels like it's tied and rooted in Afrofuturism. And the the energy that I speak about within my work, these little felted vases, they look like little shapes behind me, but they're felted vases. I call them vessels of energy and vessels of spirits. So I think I'm pulling from a couple of different things. Whether it's the way energy becomes encapsulated in something, or we encapsulate energy in something to take it with us or to take us somewhere. What we're wearing, what we need to wear, what we need to cover, what's our armor, all of those things become a part of my work. And I mentioned Sun Ra because like thinking about the embellishment of his garments, the color choices, the patterning, the repetition. Um, the body is heavily adorned when he's going to space, and I think adornment is plays a big role in my work. Because what are the things that my body's carrying on me as I'm being channeled or transitioning to this space? All of my figures have something on them, whether it's their face or their body, their feet or their hands, or carrying something spiritually. So I think all of that is informing my work. And Kyra, I love seeing you nodding your head because I feel like it's resonating with you. So I'm excited to see how it informs your work.
And so,
I
yeah,
oh,
please.
I love the term adornment. That just really like lit me up. Yeah, absolutely. As Cassandra mentioned, I am also a New York neo-futurist. That is a discipline of experimental theater that deals in the present and the now. We don't play characters. We don't pretend anything on stage. Everything we write and perform about is from our lived experiences of the now. And so within that context of neo-futurism, I've written one or two pieces that I consider Afrofuturist. The first one was like a very simple, based on the sort of as ourselves, me and another Black performer, just like speaking about the future and how we envisioned it. I did another going back to Sun Ra, another piece that was an audio soundscape that used Sun Ra and also the voices of several Black women in my life, also imagining the future. I also had some audio from uh, when the Little Mermaid trailers first came around, and there were people were videoing their Black daughters being so excited that there was a Black Little Mermaid. I have some of that audio in there of just very um looking, yeah, just like looking towards the future and like how we picture it. And with, and also as neo-futurists, adornment is something that we often play with, especially and on the more queer side of neo-futurism, of like how we adorn ourselves to be seen as ourselves, and what do we wear that makes us like legible as ourselves. I was very excited when you brought that up.
Well, you both, as you talked about adornment, I always think about the funeral practices from different countries in Africa and that have continued in African American society. And and I was wondering, have you all thought about those particular connections and what's really being transmitted when you talk about the importance of this adornment and how it has a spiritual quality and association with that?
Yeah, it's definitely something I think about, and I don't know if I can think about Afrofuturism without thinking about spirituality. Like, so it feels so overlapped, and so connected. But I thought about the use of the color white and painting white on one's face or dressing in white as a way to connect spiritually with the ancestors. I feel like that there are a number of ways that gesture or um, ritual appears in like American South and Black Southern spirituality practices. So I think the two, I don't know if I can say the two, like they feel like they're sisters. They, not that they can't exist on their own, but they're related.
I agree. I agree. I think there is, even in just everyday experience, there is ritual and adornment. Yeah, and I think as you said, especially in Black culture, where we dress a certain way for certain situations, and we really try to make ourselves known by how we adorn ourselves, and people usually have their own sort of personal ritual of like how they get ready for the world to perceive them.
It's interesting. I just want to, if it's all right for me to jump in.
Yeah.
In all the speaking of adornment and the spirituality connection to it, it brings me back to when I called you, I think it was 2 years ago, we did the Elegance and Divinity, and it was a tea dedicated to hats in Black culture and the role that head adornment plays. And we got involved with Professor Green, Professor Omiemi Green over at William and Mary, who is a spiritual practitioner of the Isheshe tradition. And so she came in with the various different head adornments, and the way that they fold things means different things as far as their rank within the, and what we did was we combined a tea with a fashion show specifically to talk about how adornment indicates the past, the present, the future, the amount or the style of spiritual expression. And what you're saying is really resonating, even though that's not my lived experience, right? But and they talked a lot about how the design of those things led them into the future, that fashion was a nod to the future as much as it was the past. And there were a lot of conversations about how to carry out that event respectfully and appropriately, given the importance, particularly of head adornment, of crowns, of because you notice that in certain types of, I'm thinking movie and television depictions of Africans and African Americans in the future, but not in others. Like in Star Trek, you don't necessarily see that, but you definitely see that in, say, something like Black Panther. I'm thinking in pop culture, how are you seeing these concepts you're talking about with adornment and fashion playing out in pop culture right now?
I didn't say it was Star Trek. You would, because you get Whoopi's hats.
Oh yeah, Whoopi.
That's
true.
iconic.
I'm thinking like Deep Space Nine
The
and
Whoopi
Discovery
hat.
when we first start seeing African American captains, right?
Yeah.
Like 6 series in, right? But I didn't think about Whoopi. I forgot Whoopi was
especially in
on there. That's
Nexus.
true. Yeah.
The Nexus movie that she's got all the hats, and they
That's
change
true.
depending on her connection to the Nexus.
Yes.
No, it actually reminded me of Nadia Korafor's Binti novella series. If anybody's read those, there's one point at which the alien turns her locks into tentacles. And that's like part of the reason why the alien species reached out to her in particular, was because her locks were understandable to them, because their sensory organ, right, was these tentacles on their head, and she has this meltdown, right? The character has a kind of a crisis of identity when she wakes up and discovers that this has been done to her. And then when she goes home, she has to wrangle with what has happened to her hair, and how that's changed her identity. And it's, really striking. So I would say if you haven't read that novella series, it's wonderful. But it definitely plays with a lot of these ideas about adornment, and because she talks a lot about how she puts clay on her locks. That was what her tribe did, and she brings that into space with her.
Well, I immediately, when you all were talking about the white clothing, or, dressing someone in white, I thought about all of the baptisms that happen, especially in the South, and historically, that people wore white, especially if they were getting baptized in rivers, in lakes and so forth, that European society does not define white in the same way that African societies define white. And their definition is very spiritual, but it is not what people think. It doesn't have a good or evil representation, but it has a more of a spiritual connection with the afterlife, or with, I would say, a different dimension of reality. And I was wondering, do you all incorporate any of that into your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever I am working performatively, or when I'm working performatively, a mask is involved, and that kind of became the start of my performance work. I made a mask, and I didn't know what I was going to do with it, or what performance it was going to be in, but I knew it was going to be performed, and I knew a Black woman would wear it. And over the years, that has been the kind of reoccurring happening. These masks are worn predominantly by Black women. Oftentimes they've been worn by Black men, but there's a channeling that's happening where the conversation is you are no longer yourself or yourself alone. You're channeling the presence or spirit of another. And ancestry becomes a big part of my work because of that. I'm really interested in the using my performances to um, engage with the Black history of the land that I get to do the performance on, whether that's in Cleveland or Richmond or Savannah. There's always some part of the history um, within our Black presence in the American South from enslavement to the present um, that is being engaged with, that's being highlighted, that's being talked about in one way or another, but thinking about these people that we're reaching spiritually as people, and how are we connecting with them, and how are we bringing them back and honoring them and uplifting them, and not thinking about the circumstance of which they might have arrived to this country, but all that they came with and all that they left for us. That becomes a big part of my performance work, and I think it finds itself in my sculptural work outside of performance, in the way I'm talking about these little faces that reappear, that become these vessels of spiritual energy, in the same way that they're supporting the felted subject that's in the sculpture with it. But all of those things are like major conversations in my work.
You know, you brought up a point that is actually relevant. Many of us who teach American and African American history always have students who will say, why is it that we're starting talking about slavery? Didn't these people have an existence prior to? Is it confined? So years ago, historians began to talk about that culture, because some people may have been born into slavery, but they were not confined to the condition of their birth. They were human beings first and foremost. And so young people are pushing that envelope. They reject this idea of defining people based on whatever status someone else made them have at any particular time.
Well, isn't that also sort of like a superpower of Afrofuturism? Because in thinking about the African identity or the Black identity in the future, you're able to free yourself of looking at the circumstance predominantly and looking at the person. I thought that really struck me, Nastassja, when you were saying that we're looking at the people, not the circumstances under which they were there. It's something that we do a lot in the theater, and something that we certainly are trying to do more when we're looking at programming music and other types of performative art as a curator. But I think that's one of the things that strikes me in listening that Afrofuturism does particularly well, because it's looking forward and not into the past. So you have that little bit of extra freedom from the circumstance, and the focus is on the human being, the character, the story.
Yeah, I feel like I feel two different ways about it, because I definitely love a narrative that doesn't, just put us on the slave train and that's it. I do think, there are ways of doing Afrofuturism that kind of like lives like alongside the circumstances, but doesn't censor it. Like thinking specifically again, like M.K. Jemisin has The City We Became. I read the short story version of it, and it is very sci-fi. It's a very like magic realism also elements, but it definitely kind of lives in a world that still like has like the history of slavery and systemic racism, and the sort of creatures that are like rising up sort of against the main character, like are like kind of are embodied in like the bodies of policemen that then sort of like form into like this like mass of just like limbs and badges. And so I think there's so many ways to tell these stories. And I just I don't want to like dismiss that is
Sure,
one way to
sure.
like tell it like alongside the circumstances, but not censor the circumstances.
I think that's a great point, Kyra, because when I think about the need to reimagine, or the need and desire to think about the future, so much of it is because of the circumstance, um, and not feeling a place in the current and needing to find ways, create ways, imagine ways to transport to this other place, um, creatively, physically, emotionally, mentally. I think so much of that is because what's happening alongside the reimagining. So I think you bring up a great point.
So
Yeah,
the
yeah, not to
circum
say that we can't imagine these beautiful
yeah.
futures where like what's slavery? I don't know.
No, but it makes sense that
Yeah,
you would
yeah.
use the circumstance as inspiration for the why we need this other thing too. That,
Hmm.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, you all reminded me of of this image that I selected that you see here with this woman whose eyes are actually blended into a knife, and this hat that's there that represents so many different things. And so that leads me to really ask this next question: how has Afrofuturism impacted music, theater, film, art, and fashion? And you don't have to speak to all of those, but I'm going to give you some freedom, wiggle room, to try to speak to some of those. So, Kyra, can you start us off?
Yeah, so about 5 or 6 years ago, I decided to write a poem a day for Black History Month, and and each day had a different like person as the subject. And one day I did Janelle Monáe. It was very short. I think it said the future is a Black woman in a tuxedo, and she doesn't give any F's about your um, word for male approval.
I think you posted that on socials, though. I
I
think as
did.
I feel
I
like I've
did.
seen that on your.
Yes. Um, and yeah, it's so because that was one of the first like images of her that I saw was when she was in that era of sort of like you had the pompadour and the tuxedo and this embracing of like both the masculine and the feminine. And I get really excited, especially like in Afrofuturism when it blends like both like the Black experience and the queer experience of 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 just like redefining what it means like to be a person moving through this world, especially a Black person moving through this world. So I think Janelle Monáe has done so much with that, and still is doing so much with that. I think the movie Nope is probably one of my favorite. Like of like current, like I would qualify that as like an Afrofuturist story of and that kind of goes into what we were talking about earlier about it really it was just like a story. It really, was alongside the circumstances, but the circumstances were not censored at all in that movie. You knew they lived in a world where there had been slavery and systemic racism, but it wasn't like the central plot point
Right.
of the film. It was them, running their father's business and wild alien things happen. It's a great movie. That's what I have from the top, but yeah, I want to pop it over to Natasha.
Yeah, I think what the impact Afrofuturism has on all and more of these fields and topics, I think it opens it opens the box, or maybe it completely smashes the box where there is no box, and it's not just about making it bigger, but it's just as an open space. And I think it allows for the possibility of something beyond what anyone says it should be. It's no longer one dimensional. Um, it allows, I know everyone has a feeling about him, but it allows for Kanye to make an album like 808 and Heartbreak. Like, what does it mean? You talked so much, Cassandra, about hip hop. I think whether we think about it or not, Afrofuturism plays such a role in one's ability to break outside of the confines of what a rapper can be and what hip hop can be. And it's not about, it doesn't just have to be about one's past, one's upbringing. What are you wearing? It's not just about the jerseys and the do-rags and like all those things that we love about Black culture, and we know it plays a big role in hip hop. But like when artists start to find their way and get to do little different things while still staying true to what they feel is in their kind of realm or world of hip hop, I feel like they're reimagining what they can be and what they can do as artists. We talk so much about adornment, and I think that is so visually present in this image. Um, the adornment of her hat, and the hat is a spaceship, but then it also reminds me of a church hat and that neck guard. And I thought a lot about armor, and I know I spoke a little bit about it before, but like one's thinking about adornment and armor and one's like what they're wearing on their body to protect or soothe or comfort or aid in their journey. We see that so much in fashion, even down to like the now adornment of like Crocs and these little, like, I forget what they're called, but these little like
Gibbets.
embellishments. Yeah, the
I have them
gadgets,
all
like,
over my house. Thanks for
right.
the
But like
9-year-old.
all of these little things that I think consciously we're not aware of how they play a role in adornment and embellishment and maybe larger conversations that are a part of that, but it's it's everywhere.
Can, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say one of the most striking things to me about Afrofuturism is cluttering up the way that people are dressed in the world, because previously the future images were sterile. They were, people wore almost jumpsuits that were monocolored.
Unitards.
Yes. And what Afrofuturism has done is really flip that complete. Actually, they've kicked that out of the door. And they have said, what is wrong with claiming your culture and bringing that into the present and into the future, and not seeing the future as being a sterile, vacuous space, no pun intended, that doesn't include, but rather it has almost excluded people's pasts and their ancestors and their culture. And so I find that whole, flipping everything on its head as being tremendously important, not only to artists, but to expressionism and to how people are now really taking that and running with it.
I had a question I wanted to ask them, and this might seem like a silly question, but I'm thinking maybe Nastassja said that Afrofuturism is breaking the box. It's saying that we don't have to imagine Black art as what it should be. It's anything, right? So by that concept, because folks, we are in the new season of Bridgerton, does Shonda Rhimes' works and Bridgerton, does that technically qualify as Afrofuturism because it's reimagining a past that is far more blended and Afrocentric? Like, can it be classified as Afrofuturism if it's reimagining the past, or is it only if it's reimagining the future? And that's just me asking because I'm not an Afrofuturistic artist. So where do you fall on that? Is that piece of current pop culture embracing Afrofuturism by rewriting the past, or is it something entirely different?
Yeah, I guess I would think of it as more of like a alternate universe, like fan fiction of of that period of time. But I think it's a very interesting question that you pose. Can does the future go both backwards and forwards in these stories? I think it can. I think especially if they were to, create a new show that like saw this through over several centuries, could be really interesting. But I think I personally haven't really thought of it as Afrofuturism, but yeah, I look more like the AU fan fiction.
Yeah, I hadn't originally classified that way, but when Nastassja said that, I was like, oh, it's breaking all the rules. Does that mean the space-time continuum is broken too? What do you think, Nastassja?
So don't shame me, but I've never watched Bridgerton. However, I recently just saw a thread of I don't know what this character's name would be, but I saw a thread on Instagram of all of her hairstyles.
Oh, that's
Queen Charlotte.
His gray hair, yeah, and I saw that and I was like, ooh.
Yeah, the swan
I
one.
like this.
Yeah.
Because it's the big hair, the big kind of, I don't know, classical European George Washington styles that we know or learned about, and those big white wigs. However, seeing the braids and the Bantu knots and like these hairstyles that are African, but then they build up to create this headdress that are also African. Like it felt like it was imagining, it was creating this new, I don't even know the word to call it. It was creating this new thing that checked all of these boxes, headdress, hair, which, I mean, we see that with the way Black women style our hair now, across the diaspora. So I think that someone said something to me about the time we're living currently has already happened, has already happened. We're just like experiencing the process of that time, which I'm still trying to wrap my head around. And when he said it, I was like, there's so many questions I have.
Quantum physics, right?
If now is the past, then the past is just, I don't know, the past squared, then I feel like you kind of find my way back to the point I was making. I feel like if the box is being broken in a way, like any of it, if that's being reimagined and becomes it pushes outside of conventional norms, like it might not fit all the way in the box, but I feel like there's some overlap and there's a thread there. So yeah, kind of Kyra in the same space as you, but I could see it.
Thank you for indulging me. Your comment just totally drove me there. How would I classify that? I don't know anymore.
I don't know. I almost see it as alternate history. I see
Yeah.
it kind of along the lines of, I don't know if anybody's read Justina Ireland's Dread Nation series, which is a zombie like series of books, but set in an alternate universe where the South did not lose the Civil War.
Oh my.
And so it's a very interesting. It's set in the West, like in the 1870s. So
Oh, wow.
Black teenage girl in the West is protecting her younger sibling from zombies, and like, but it's very much this kind of, you know, these what if kind of alternate history, alternate reality, which are very fanciful in many of their aspects. Like I could definitely see Bridgerton being a fantasy. But I always see Afrofuturism as very much like sci-fi, future, even if it's, you know, near future. That it's much more technology informed.
But isn't even that a box? Like, is that a restriction or a confinement? If even that's a category that can't be blurred? Don't have to answer it, just posing it out there. I don't have the answer for it either, but came to mind.
Well, you know, a lot of people have actually forgotten that our films actually did not depict history accurately, period. You know, how many times have you seen white actors playing indigenous people? And you know, and taking over a story and reimagining it to being something that actually did not happen, or it didn't happen that particular way. And so I see Bridgerton as taking the present, because Afrofuturism is also about the present, and throwing it into the past in the way that science fiction has always done. They've sort of done that long back. So what would happen if we changed this piece and that piece? What would be the outcome? And by changing that, then let's see what would have happened in that society, you know, moving forward. And so they've taken the present, thrown it back to the past, where people are very involved with each other. There are a lot of interracial exchanges going on. And by the way, there were a lot of them going on back then as well. But these are now public and in upper crust society. And so let's talk about that, looking at it through that different lens. And so I tend to kind of throw that, as you can tell, I kind of throw that into an Afrofuturism category simply because science fiction has never been confined to reality or to the space-time continuum. And now that we are getting into multiverses, and scientists talking about how which multiverse are we actually in? So it's like, okay, so we're now in the process of combining philosophy with physics, and we're really blowing people's minds. So is your reality really reality? That's really the question. So Afrofuturism to me kind of in some way poses that question, or forces a difference in perspective. And I don't know if either of you, in pursuing your work, if you kind of push those boundaries, and allow the audience's brains to be blown away because of these different images and these different ideas that you're throwing out.
That's a good question. I'm thinking about kind of what I've been navigating as a neo-futurist in my more recent work. So I'm also one of the co-artistic directors of the company, and navigating that as a Black woman, definitely has its challenges. And I've written some work like that just sort of deals with it, and it's very cathartic. Kind of looking at just sort of the expectation to sort of always have it together, even when I'm mad or frustrated, and having to do the work while 20 different eyes are on me, figuring it out as I go. Um, and so I wrote it, and so I guess I'm bringing it up because I'm wondering if, within Afrofuturism, is that, because we're talking about like the present is the past, but can the present also, can it be more amorphous? Because I think when I write these things, I'm writing as myself right now, um, and just kind of presenting it as like, hey, this is what I'm going through, and this is like just very like it's without any pretense of like without like that mask of that society expects of you. So I had this one play in the show last time I was performing where I would come out and just kind of, lose my marbles and like throw furniture around and like throw myself against the wall while one of my colleagues was very slowly walking from upstage right to downstage left. And then I have to explain the show a little bit really quickly. We have a clothesline that goes across the stage with sheets of paper on it, with the numbers 1 through 30, and each sheet of paper represents a play that we've written for the weekend of shows, and the audience decides what order we perform them in, and when they shout a number, we pull it down and perform that play. So in this play, the my colleague would slowly walk downstage as I'm freaking out, and then they would jump and grab one of the numbers themselves, and they would tell me what play it was, and then I would have to set that next play up entirely by myself after lots of like high energy freaking out, and the rest of the cast would just come and quietly observe me while even if it was like a big setup, I was just moving everything by myself. And so it's sort of I think like taking experiences and like putting it in the abstract, like is that, even if it's in the present, is that a form of Afrofuturism? I don't know. I'm starting to ask myself why I started down this road. So I don't remember where I started, which is also time is an illusion.
There you go. Well done.
And that actually leads me to another question. Some scholars trace Afrofuturism to the works of Miles Davis and Herbie Hancock when they used synthesized sounds, and George Clinton with his Mothership Connection. What do you see as the origins of Afrofuturism? Nastassja, I'm going to let you take a first stab at that one.
Yeah, so I thought a lot about this question. So to make my answer make sense, before we got here, you were talking about the difference in um kind of white-centered futurism being this like leotard jumpsuit, nothing was on the body, and I didn't something came to mind, but then we shifted questions. Um and I thought a lot about um again adornment and everything, but my first trip to the continent and going to Burkina Faso. That was the first time that I had went to Africa. I was in Ouagadougou, and you see images and you watch things, but I just remember being in admiration of the adornment of the body and what was on the head and what was on the back and what was around the waist and what was hanging, what was on the like there was just so much. And I think when you talked about that flip, um it's not for me, it's not just about bringing the culture, it's also like our understanding of how this becomes a vehicle and we're going on a journey, and what do I want to bring with me on this journey, and finding different ways to utilize my head if it can carry something around my neck, something around my shoulders, my waist, my back. And I feel like in thinking of all of that, the continent of Africa feels like the root of Afrofuturism, like because we're pulling from those things culturally, and we found ways to kind of detail it, to call it something, whether it's a synthesizer or whatever, but that's where it started. Um, yeah, so that I can't pin it on a person because it feels like it's a culture.
I really like that response. Yeah. Um, I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of the elements that we see in Afrofuturism stem directly from Africa. I think if you look at more of like diaspora origins, I was kind of going through like who I think like really sort of broke molds, and that led me to the question of like, is it kind of always an art maker that inspires those things? Like I was thinking about like Madam C.J. Walker, for example, like kind of creating this whole like new reality of like what a black woman could be, like like incredibly wealthy, started her own business, like really like brought forward lots of like new like products and technologies for like black women hair. Is that like was that a sort of like art imitates life moment where that could have inspired stories down the road? I think like Nastassja said, it's really kind of like a cultural origin of just how we have existed for so many years.
I love that you ask them, though, in the context of music. When you think about music, what musicians or what pieces do you instinctively associate with Afrofuturism? Because I mean, I don't know that I would have associated Miles Davis with Afrofuturism, but George Clinton, I could totally see. I think it's just what you personally see as a sound of a futuristic sound. But what do you think when the two of you sort of close your eyes and hear a sound? What is the sound of Afrofuturism?
Definitely Sun Ra is always the first that comes to mind for me. I think he really embodied it in a lot of different ways. Um, yeah, and Janelle Monáe, who we also talked about earlier, especially in her older work. I don't know as much now, the things she's writing now, but I think like oh, I can't remember the name of the album. I can't remember the name of the album, but I think she's definitely dealt in it. There's a Beverly Glenn Copeland was he is a trans black man who really like brought the synthesizer into the 80s 90s, like was one of the first to really like create a full album that use this specific type of synthesizer that he uses on it. Big fan of his.
Yeah, I'm really good at answering a question with a question. And some people around me hate it, but thinking about Afrofuturism beyond like the tropes, for lack of a better word, or characteristics, or these things when we think of it, it's like, okay, to be Afrofuturistic or to be futuristic in general, it has to do this, be this, or sound like this, and how so much of that kind of feels contradictory. But also to think about like at different points in time, would a new thing or a new occurrence or a new sound be futuristic? Like we attribute country music and the blues to Black people. Before those things existed, when the first person did it, would that have been considered futuristic, even though it had sound nothing like Sun Ra? And sounds nothing like the sounds that Kyra you're mentioning with Janelle Monáe. So I feel like that's why I say it's hard to like if we're talking about it in through the lens of like it has to do certain things. Like with the conversation around Beyonce's album, and everyone's like, it's not a country album. Does country have to do certain things to be considered country? Does R&B have to do certain things to be R&B? Like when do we get to decide that something is um, a futuristic version of the thing we've already experienced or that we already know because it's doing something different? So I think that I'm curious about you guys' thoughts on that, but also that's my way of cheating out of giving you a direct answer.
No, I'm really glad you're keeping us honest because you're absolutely right. But also very clever.
That's cool. She's going space-time continuum. If you asked me 10 years ago, would it still be futuristic?
Yeah.
I don't even know what dimension I'm in right now.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I think you stumbled upon the answer though in your question is that is it, is it like music we haven't heard before, or is it using like elements that we associate with the future, or do we do ourselves a disservice to not give Black music the space in like the out of the box space that you described earlier, to be what it wants to be, to imagine any sounds that it wants to imagine, or does it, yeah, or does it need to be like Sun Ra or synthesizers?
Well, when you look at the music or the history of music in America, you will see the addition of new instruments and or the addition of new sounds or different techniques. And that was always futuristic in so many ways. And usually, I would say that the key thing that happens is there's often a rejection by the majority of people because human beings love to do the same thing at the same time in the same way. And when you introduce something new, they immediately reject it. It's different, and we're uncomfortable. As creatures of habit, we're uncomfortable with the difference. But then over a period of time, we adapt to those differences because if you don't adapt, you die. And so as we've adapted to those differences, they then get looked upon as something new, as futuristic. And it appears that as human beings have developed and grown and exchanged ideas and information and experiences, that we see these breakouts where people start doing new things.
I was going to add to that. One of the things I feel like is missing from this conversation is the connection between Afrofuturism and the uncanny. That it's when does it feel not quite like normal? Like when does it feel not quite of this dimension, right? And maybe that's the key, right? Because, and depending on the point in time, right, it could be synthesizers with classical music, right? It could be
The banjo, because it was a new instrument.
Right? That so much Afrofuturistic literature and film has these moments where you are, the audience is out of place, right, in some way. And that, going back to that question, I was thinking about like African spiritual tales, right? And so many of them deal with the uncanny, right? With places that don't feel like they're in this world. And that's such a key piece of the genre in some ways that maybe that's a way to think about it.
So obviously, this conversation, we hope, will spur some real additional creativity from the two of you. And we hope that you will share that creativity with us. And that really leads me to this question about asking you to describe your experiences in developing works in music or the arts that really reflects Afrofuturism. So, Kyra, I'm going to ask you first.
I think for me it's not a process that I really like think a ton about. I think because of what Nastassja has really said, that where it's like it's kind of whatever we want it to be, right? It's this really beautiful space where we can explore and experiment and decide for ourselves like what it means to work within this genre. I like when I made the Afrofuturist audio piece, I used Sun Ra like as a bed, but I was so excited to use like the voices of like my colleagues. I also just like I used like found sound. Like I at the time I was making it, I had this very creaky chair that I ended up recording and doing like vocalizing while in the chair, like to just kind of evoke like a grandmother on a porch in a rocking chair. Like I really loved like having that texture in it of like I I I think in my personal art making, there's a lot of like marriage between past, present, and future, like all kind of coexisting all the time. Um, so having like the grandmother in the chair with like Sun Ra in another room, I actually did like played Sun Ra like on a speaker in another room and then recorded it. So it was like had this distance to it as well. And so that my friends' voices were sort of then mixed in to that kind of blurry space. And I also included some music from Coolio, who had just passed away. I think like in the week or so that I was working on the piece. And I used his song See You When You Get There. Because it was I think the whole thing was sort of like a question of like, yeah, like what is next? Well, we definitely know what's next for the individual is, where Coolio is now. Um, so kind of thinking about that aspect of the future, and then of course the Little Mermaid audio.
Thank you. Natasha.
Yeah, I can I brought up a new body of work, but I didn't go into detail about what's happening with it, and I think that speaks directly to Afrofuturism and what I'm pulling from. I specifically chose to rewatch Space is the Place because one of my figures, there's 6 new sculptures that are going to be made, and each of them, um, the entire project has been researching different hoods as a garment and looking at these garments across generations and geographical locations and looking at the subjects who wear them, the difference in language around each subject, and then a new body of work would form out of that. And I haven't started making it, but I've spent 6 months researching it. So I've pulled from texts and archives and sound and film and imagery, as well as other artists and uh, both performance and visual. Um, and I think that what's happening with one of the 6, and it's the title is actually pulling from a Sun Ra title. He has a song called Night of the Purple Moon, but spelled like day and night. And I've shifted that title, at least a part of it. I'm still figuring out the other half, but I've shifted that to be night as a knight with armor, Night of the Purple Moon. And this 6 character each sculpture has a theme. There's girlhood, matriarch, um, the Black church, reclamation, respectability politics, and Black masculinity. And Black masculinity is the one where I've definitely been interested in futurism and looking at the garments of Sun Ra and thinking about this heavy embellishment. Sorry if you can see my dog. This heavy embellishment, and what's on his shoulders and what's on his head, and finding the overlap between what he's taking on this journey of a safer space, um, a more inclusive space, a space without um, perceived violence or stereotype, um, and what are on his feet. And the color of that sculpture is going to be black, but it's also going to be, there's some shine that happens. I'm really interested in like that detail of silver or chrome or glisten, in relation to the stars, in this other universe that this male figure is going to be, this purple moon that he's going to be venturing and taking a journey to. So what happens in my work is I'm thinking about all of these things, whether it's coming from a text, an image, an audio, a video, and like finding where it lands in color or texture or pattern, or material. I'm going to be using like roof shingles, stitched into tulle, embellished with silver beads, and thinking about like the usage of a roof shingle plays many roles. It's speaking about Black labor. Um, it's speaking to the men in my life and who have been in my life that work with their hands, but also thinking about where's the starting point of this journey and thinking of him lifting off from this roof. So like it finds its way into every facet of my work.
That is so interesting. We're close to the end of our discussion, and I want to give time that we can really kind of dissect this last question. And you all have kind of hinted at some of this, but I wanted to explore this. So, what are the ongoing challenges for Black artists engaging in their fields from the perspective of Afrofuturism? So, Nastassja, you want to start that one?
I think it goes back to what I was saying before about what's possible. And and before we were talking about, I think, film or music, but what characters we get to play, what characters we get to create. Like I'm currently reading Cast, The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson, and thinking about this hierarchy and where Black people are supposed to be and the roles we're supposed to take on and how we're supposed to behave and speak and live and walk and move and exist. That goes for all of us within the subordinate caste system. So anything that goes beyond what's been set for a Black person, an African person, a person of color, I think you start to disrupt a system and you start to challenge, one's power or perception of power and perception of control. And just like people don't like anything new, they don't like when when roles get shifted. I was listening to the book earlier, and she said that equality means a demotion, for someone of the dominant caste. And in our country, that being, white people. So if sorry, she's growling, for a Black artist to choose to create a character that's not subordinate, to create a character that's, has power and has joy and is doing something, to be a person who has power and has joy and wants to shift outside of a box, that disruption comes with conflict. And I think what's been important for me is to have community and find community, build it, and create opportunities amongst ourselves that aren't so rooted in this hierarchical system, that tells us where we should be, and like creating opportunities that don't exist. So instead of waiting for that thing to happen for me, how do I create it, and how do I create it with the people around me? I'm new to Petersburg roughly for the past 2 years, but just this past Sunday, I co-organized this collective conversation of artists in the area just so we can get together and talk to each other. What do you need? What do you need help with? What don't you understand? What would you like to see in this area? We could wait for the city of Petersburg to do all these beautiful things, but like the beauty of being an artist in any genre is our ability to problem solve and create solutions for problems. So I think this collective power and this communal power is something that I definitely tried to encourage and tap into as a way to kind of like um, not avoid, because it almost doesn't feel like you can avoid it, but to combat or to have something alongside this structure that might create challenges for thinking of perspectives of Afrofuturism.
I'm so glad you brought up something you were reading and then went into what you said next, because it made me think of like something I started doing maybe 9 or 10 years ago that I really love, and I wish I talked about it more. I just don't think to. Is when I'm reading a book, especially a book where the author chooses not to like really like uh, explicitly describe what a character looks like. I just make them black in my head. And it was something I realized that I wasn't doing before because, so much of our media is so white centric, but just in my own like personal practice of like consuming literature, like especially like when I read a lot of fantasy novels. It's like a really book I'm reading right now is like, what if the Napoleonic Wars had dragons? So it's like, well, yeah, why can't the main character be black? There's
The
dragons.
Temeraire series, those are.
Yes.
I love
That's what I'm reading.
those.
It's so good. I'm on the second one. Yeah, I made the main character a black man.
Yeah, why
And
not? They never. That's true. They never describe him.
They really
describe the
don't
women,
describe what he
but
looks
not the
like.
men. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up because as soon as you said that, I remember we had a conversation in the audience, in the office, where you talked about that. You don't talk about it necessarily a lot, but you were like, "Oh, I just imagine that person is black." I was like,
Oh, funny.
that's really
That was probably
interesting.
around the
I
time I
wonder-
started doing it.
Yeah,
we
I mean,
worked together.
because that has actually come up in some like book club discussions about like how do you paint the character when there's no distinctive painting there. I think that's cool that you brought that up.
Before you get off that, I'm reminded of these recent nonsensical outrages that happened with the Little Mermaid and with the stormtroopers in the most recent
Yeah.
Star Wars. Stormtroopers are not black.
Well, how would we know they're?
They're fictional characters.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? And they always wore helmets. You don't know what they look like, but it speaks to their imagination and to their definition of who has a right to be in the room and who doesn't. And of course, with the Little Mermaid, oh my God, this is a fictional character. How do you know? There is no such thing as a mermaid. So you can't say there are no black mermaids. There are no mermaids. But they went directly to where you expect them to go culturally. And that is to this idea that blacks don't exist in certain worlds.
Well, and it speaks to that in our society, deficit thinking is rampant. What Nastassja was saying about when you have any society that is hierarchical based, there is a tendency for whatever group is in power, and in America, or whatever group is in the majority. In America, historically, that has been white people, and there is an epidemic of deficit thinking. More for you does not actually mean less for me. And I think some of the things that are brilliant in the arts is that in visual art, and particularly in theater and music, more music of one style does not equate less music of another style. More actors on stage does not actually equal less playtime for you if it's an ensemble experience. So in the arts, you're conditioned somewhat, because certainly deficit thinking still exists in the arts, but you're conditioned early on in your training to start losing that way of thinking. And I think that's why conversations, like I was mentioning to them, Kyra, that I still have an elephant you crocheted for Holly before she was born. Conversations and artworks and things that we discussed in our process of how do we educate kids with the arts, those kinds of things stuck with me in the way that I think it was a lunchtime conversation in passing. It struck me. And I know one time we were talking about Shakespeare, because just like with The Little Mermaid, you've got folk tales, you've got a theater that was written centuries ago. And we're performing it today. Why only let Othello be black? Why not a black Mercutio? It was one of the things I loved about Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet. Why not? Why not? Because it didn't mean less of a role for any of the other actors. They still, so that just really struck me about what you were saying, is that it's combating deficit thinking in the way that Nastassja's doing it, where she's not saying, I'm going to force my town to change. I'm going to just make the change happen alongside of it, and people are going to organically see that more for us does not mean less for you. It's all just happening at once. I think that's very futuristic thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember when I first started doing this like head canon, when I read books, really kind of was like a moment of pause for me, because it was so interesting to me that, like, even though like I grew up with like my mom is a doctor, my dad is like a certified financial planner. Like I saw, like I grew like all but one of my teachers in elementary school was a black woman. Like I like grew up like knowing, like kind of like always knowing I could be what anything I wanted to be, that like black people could be whatever they wanted, but like still like the systemic like hierarchy of like a white centered narrative like still is like lived in my head rent free. And and like kind of like had to take like actionable steps to imagine the media I consume as more black centric.
Reclaiming that space and
Yeah.
reclaiming how your head is seeing the rest of the world. I think that's really beautiful.
Well, I'm surprised that neither of you talked about just this definition. How do we actually define Afrofuturism? And is it going to stay the same definition? Or is it going to grow and morph into something more than we can imagine for right now? And so your challenge is, how do you keep up with this evolution of ideas?
I think we didn't talk about it because I think we kind of came to the collective agreement that it's like really whatever we want it to be, right? It's in like this really free space that, if we are, creating work that centers Black people and is like of our truth and like what we want to see in the world. So I think, yeah, that maybe that's why we didn't speak to it specifically as that, but as more of like the broader scope of just like existing as Black artists.
And I think that to end on that note is really important and key. And that is allowing the space for Black artists to define what their space is and where they're going in the future. So looking back, having that Sankofa moment of looking backward to really pave the way for the present and the future is so important. And with that, I am handing our discussion back over to Hillary.
Oh, thank you. I want to take a moment to thank everyone. Nastassja, it's been a pleasure meeting you. I'm very grateful you made time for us today, and I loved learning from you today. Kyra, thank you for joining us from the dressing room on Broadway. I am so excited to see your beautiful smile. It's been far too long, and I'm grateful you joined us
so
today.
long. I miss you.
I miss you too. And you both gave us such an exciting conversation. And thank you, Dr. Richmond and Dr. Newby-Alexander, for being my partners in education with this series, and all of the folks at NSU, Stevelyn Adams, and Alex Dye, who handle all of the marketing that we'll be doing in the future. for this podcast series. This episode will release in December as we look to the future of 2025. And our first episode, if you missed it, was released on June during Juneteenth week and can be live streamed. There's also an episode in September. Thank you so much for the opportunity for the 2024 podcast series. I can't wait to see where we venture in 2025 and what adornments and ideas and needs and challenges we're going to encounter there too. So thank you all, and until next time, keep learning.